Now I'd like to take a moment to talk about cell phones in our schools, which is what brought me to Guilderland High School here today. I just met with parents, educators, local leaders, advocates, to hear from them about the challenge of cell phones in schools and how they impact our children's education. And talking about, is this actually the kind of environment we want to have for our children to continue to learn in? 2 years ago, I started holding mental health listening sessions with teenagers to find out why the rates of suicide, depression, anxiety were so high for them. We came to the conclusion that addictive social media algorithms were affecting the mental health of children and teens in a significant way. In fact, the Surgeon General of the United States came to the same conclusion. Those listening sessions here in New York led us to take on the social media companies that create these addictive algorithms, and we did something very significant about it. Last month, I signed into law 2 bills that protect our children from these addictive feeds and protect them from having online entities collect personal identifying information about them and selling it to other entities. We knew those bills would face intense opposition from big tech and all the entrenched interests, but we developed our policies smart and pragmatically by making sure that the community was incorporated every step of the way. We involved teachers, educators, parents in those earlier conversations, which led us to the result that we're so proud of, nation leading. The result was clear. We overcame the intense lobbying, and it passed almost unanimously. That's what brings me here to today. That is our methodology. That's how we can kickstart the conversation with a similarly thoughtful plan around cell phones in our schools. I saw a statistic last month that I haven't been able to forget, that 72% of teachers across the nation report that cell phones are a major distraction for students in their classrooms. Same study found that 95% of 13 to 17-year-olds have access to smartphones, and they're receiving over 250 notifications per day on average. So, a couple of observations. I am the first mom governor of New York. I'm hardwired to worry about our children and their safety, of course. But it's also impossible to ignore the reality that this generation, more than others, is being subjected to distractions that never existed the way they are now. There's a screen flashing in their face. They're experiencing FOMO. Are they missing out on something at this very moment? And what I heard from teachers who are trying so hard to just do what's right, but the principals, the superintendents also told me about what happens when students are there capturing everything that happens with their cell phone. It's instigating more fights, and they're setting up activities that they want to capture so they can become a social media star themselves. So it's feeding itself and the constant pull of attention away from their studies. I'm not blaming the kids, I'm not blaming the parents, I'm not blaming the administrators. It's hard enough for adults to pull themselves away from cell phones. I can't imagine how hard it is for these young people as well. But also, it's time to start figuring out solutions here. The status quo is not working for our children in particular. And I want to make sure we continue to incorporate community feedback. I want to hear from more parents and hear from more teachers. So we're going to focus on this. I'm going other places around the state. This is my first stop, studying what other states are doing as well. So the same playbook we use to address teenage mental health, we're incorporating again to begin the process. I was joined by a number of our local elected officials, starting with Mayor Kathy Sheehan. She joined us. Assembly members John McDonald, Pat Fahey joined us as well. And I want to thank them for being there to hear this conversation, as well as Melinda Person, who is the head of NYSED for the state of New York. So we'll be doing much more. I'm excited about this. This is an opportunity for us to lead and also to demonstrate that at times when it's difficult to enact policy at the local levels because of intense pressure from many sources, New York State can also step up and provide the guidance that is necessary at this time. Any questions?
You start with cell phones and any other related topics, and then we'll run it out.
Kevin Dugan with New York Magazine. That meeting took about an hour, about a half hour long.
Absolutely no disagreements. What we were also captivated with was the superintendent of Schoharie School Districts was laying out in detail, and I kept pressing him with questions because I was so intrigued at the fact that they have a full ban on any distractions in schools. No earbuds, no smartwatches, no smartphones, and no flip phones. They started this policy 2 years ago. They ran into a lot of opposition, anxious parents who felt that they needed to be connected with their children throughout the day, but they brought in law enforcement and let the parents hear from law enforcement that if the parent's worst nightmare actually occurs, that there's an active shooter on site and their children are in harm's way, something that every parent since Columbine has had in the back of their mind when they send their children off to school, that actually children are less safe in that environment when they're distracted with a cell phone in an incident like that, as opposed to following the leaders of the adults who are trained to know what to do. So he talked about how they overcome concerns from parents, but I was so fascinated in the outcomes. That's why it went longer. I'm guilty. I asked a lot of questions, always do. But I said, well, what's the enforcement like? How is it going? He says, we've had a huge reduction in fights because students aren't engaging this activity. They're not fighting each other online, then meeting up at the, outside of school and fighting. He says, violence has gone down, attention is up, academic outcomes are up. And so everybody wanted to know how this worked. He said over 30 school districts from around the country have come to see what they're doing. He had actually gone to a district in Massachusetts to find out how they were successful in this. And the conclusion was very much from everybody in the room that the state of New York needs to step up.
Okay, just one follow-up question. Have you gotten any pushback already from the tech lobby?
On this or everything else I do?
On this in particular, but I know there was a lot of pushback on the other.
No, and we're ready for it. I mean, I sat there and I looked at those adults in the room and I said, it's this simple. What's best for our kids? Everything else is just noise. What's best for our children? And when I can hear from a superintendent to be able to explain that the outcomes are better 2 years later, they've had a full ban. And he said, there's so many other, I could spend another half hour with you telling you what he said because I was so intrigued with this. But NYSET, Melinda Person, announced that there's going to be a forum on September 20th, gathering everyone to talk about distraction. But what they called it in Schoharie was a distraction-free school. Everything is out except for engagement with students interacting with each other, solving problems together, making eye contact. What a radical idea. They're looking at each other, talking during lunch and in study hall. So I was really excited to hear all this, and so you can blame me for the delay. I have a lot of questions.
Anything else on cell phones? All right.
Governor, do you want to have some statewide guidance in place before the start of the school year, or is this more on a rolling basis?
Well, what I heard from superintendents, and again, I'm going to Long Island, I'm going around the state, I need to hear from more people. I don't want to operate in a vacuum here, but if there's consensus that I feel coming out of a meeting like today and that's replicated elsewhere, I need to hear if there's something I'm missing. That's how I operate. I wanted to know if there's something I'm missing, but it seems to me that the district-by-district approach does not work. And I said, sometimes it's just easier to blame the governor in the state of New York when you want something done. I have taken that responsibility in a number of initiatives where sometimes it's just easier. And I said, I don't mind being the heavy because we're all fighting for our kids. So I don't anticipate a piecemeal approach will be my approach. I'll just put that out there. But I'm going to continue the conversations through the summer and certainly participate in this September 20th event. But I do have a number of options. But again, having our state legislators come up to me afterward and says, we're in this with you, we'll do this, was a very positive sign.
Governor, do you anticipate this being something that you're going to introduce through sort of, like a program bill in the next legislative session?
I'm going to reserve my options right now because certainly that's one of them, and I believe that would be a successful path forward. I'm also one of the most impatient people you ever meet. When I want to do something, I want to do it now, so I'm going to weigh that I'm going to have conversations. There's executive opportunities as well, so I just want to reserve all my options to do what's right. But, this is going to be discussed over a matter of months, but not much longer.
You don't have that webinar?
She just answered what I was going to ask.
Okay, right. All right. Other
I've got off topic though. Sure. You know, we just saw this assassination attempt with Donald Trump. Do you have any personal safety concerns? I mean, you're a prominent person who travels with security. I mean, does this raise any personal concerns for you? And how did you feel? Like, what went through your head when you heard about what happened on Saturday?
I felt a pit in my stomach of disgust that this is the level of discourse in our country where people feel at liberty to, first of all, have in their possession a military-style assault weapon, which is a weapon of mass destruction, which we've seen the ill effects in my own state of Buffalo, or hometown of Buffalo. I reference this often. So I was also struck by, what became later known as the weapon. Clearly, it was a high-powered, had high-power capacity coming off another building. But to a core, I'm a human being too, and someone harms another, a high-profile individual who I just happen to disagree with on policy. This is still another person who stepped up to offer their vision for the country. I disagree with every element of that, as does President Biden, as do members of my party. But my God, I want to continue to be that beacon of democracy that actually functions and works, and not, descend into those countries where this is the norm. You don't like a leader, you disagree with them, you take them out. You don't recognize elections. You don't even have elections. You eliminate your political opponents. That's not America, and will never be that country. That's why we are standing united to condemn this act of violence. And as far as my own safety, I have extreme confidence in the state police to do their jobs as they always have been. But I'm not changing my activities one bit, because I will never let those cowards affect what I do as the governor of the state of New York.
The Republican convention is this week. It's still going on as scheduled. Democratic convention not for another month. Do you intend on attending? I presume you do. And do you are you going to have a speaking role? Do you have any sort of sense of that at this point?
No, I plan to be there. I'm looking forward to joining our delegation. I'm having regular communications with those who are delegates from New York, and everybody's excited and energized. Last time I was at a convention in Chicago, I was there as a staffer for Tom Fricano, who is running for member of Congress, which is the most Republican district in the state of New York, that I won many years later. So it'll bring back some good memories. I look forward to being in Chicago.
Okay.
Was curious if you've spoken with President Biden since the assassination attempt, what he said, and as also, are you increasing security for any other candidates as they campaign in the next couple of months? And how have we gotten here? This kind of rhetoric we talk about a lot that's harmful. Just curious how you see how we've gotten to this moment.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, and probably give a longer answer than any you want to have to record. But I immediately went back in history in my mind. Buffalo, the site of the McKinley assassination, remembering the circumstances around JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King, the shooting of George Wallace. I mean, all these happened when I was a very young person, but politically cognizant of what was happening around me. And then, the attack on Ronald Reagan when I was, just getting to law school in Washington. And so there have been incidences like this before. All have different motivations. Ronald Reagan was someone trying to get the attention of a movie star. I mean, so you can never draw a clear line between the motivation. President McKinley was taken down by an anarchist at the Pan Am exhibition in Buffalo. So there has not been a common theme throughout. But what I've seen most recently, and not always the direct target is a political figure, but the manifestation of political hate that is driven on dark social media platforms gives people this sense of empowerment that, oh, this is horrible, I'm going to take this into my own hands and do something. Again, we have no evidence of that in this case. But I refer back to, the Christ King massacre in New Zealand, which was replicated online, the manifesto that was adopted by the person who committed the massacre on my neighbors in Buffalo. That same social media hatred, white supremacist groups. Look at the rise in anti-Semitism that has just risen to levels that no one could have foreseen. So much of this is fomented on social media platforms. And that's why when I see what's happening, the access of this information to our young people. The Buffalo shooter was 18 years old, had spent the last 2 years in a dark place during the pandemic, becoming radicalized online. That's what our social media efforts here on the state of New York, why I tripled the size of our monitoring of social media here in our state, because that is the next breeding ground for these people who use violence to promote political agendas. And so we've come a long way since 1901, but the result is that this is a more dangerous time because people feed on that and praise people and share doctrines and philosophies like they've never been able to before the advent of social media. That's why this time is even more dangerous.
So are you tweeting out how fast the AG is gonna put out those regulations, and also have you spoken to President Biden?
I didn't have a chance to speak to the president, no, not since then.
With the AG, is she gonna?
We're working, my legal department's heavily involved in this too. I mean, by statute, it is the Attorney General, but we have our ideas on what we want to see, so we're working closely together, but certainly those conversations are ongoing.
Governor, I'm sure you heard Biden's message last night from the Oval Office, telling both sides to turn down the temperature. But if I could ask you, referencing some of your public statements this year, you said, this November, this election will determine whether or not we're able to keep the republic. You said, don't estimate the rage of women in this country. They will march, they will take to the streets. There will be a rebellion against oppression. You said you ought to be concerned that your freedom, you ought to be concerned about your freedom because it could be a vestige of the past. Do you see yourself playing a role here in also adjusting your own language and maybe taking down the temperature yourself?
I would say many of those comments were directed at policies. None of them said to take up arms and harm another human being. None of them said go after a candidate. None of them said go after a president or former president. So there is a vast difference between espousing my deeply held views about what I see could happen for the future of our country and the concern that I still hold today about where we're heading as a nation, and saying that, take to the streets and march. That's what you should be doing. That's where you express your political views. You talk about that, but you don't do something like call for an insurrection, and you don't call for an attack on a place like the United States Capitol. There is a line that you never, ever cross, and I'll continue to call out those who cross that line.
And just to follow up, the governor of Virginia announced that he's going to put the flags at half-staff for that volunteer firefighter that was killed, Corey. Would you consider putting the flags at half-staff in New York for this volunteer firefighter?
That's absolutely something I would consider. Let me look at our state policy on whether that'd be an appropriate use of our state policy, but it's certainly something I'll look at today.
Last one, we gotta go.
Thanks, Laura Tagley, News 10. The gunman on Saturday fired from a location that was patrolled by local and state officers. Are you confident enough in New York State local officers and state officers to say that something similar will not happen at an event similarly high profile here?
I will say that the Secret Service, who we've dealt with many times as we had frequent visits from President Biden and Vice President Harris, they are responsible for securing the entire site. It's up to them on whether or not they're going to delegate that responsibility to local law enforcement. So I just want to tell you where the line of demarcation is. Secret Service made the decision to have locals as opposed to their own members of Secret Service, their own sharpshooters on that roof. So if the Secret Service asks our teams to step up and perform a role like that, I have extreme confidence in their ability to do it. But the decision on whether or not someone's there in the first place is up to the Secret Service. We have to defer to them on these matters because we cannot be interfering with their primary responsibility, which is to protect elected officials and candidates. So my team has extreme experience. We'll do as directed by the Secret Service, but that's the protocol when you have a high-profile visitor like that.
But should they have delegated to New York State and local officials,
Oh,
you have confidence?
if they delegate to us, oh yeah, absolutely. Ours are the best. All right, thank you. Thank you.